hope everybody can hear me clearly. I'm John Barrett. I am the chair of the webinar today. Had a great deal of interest in this following the announcement of the white paper. In order to give you some sort of structure of this webinar, after a short introduction by myself, Ian Ponter, Freddie Humphreys and Killian Garvey will each address one of the three pillars that are set out in the white paper. We're proposing that at the end of the three presentations, we'll have a question and answer session. In order to manage the number of questions that we're anticipating, if you do want to raise a question, we use the question and answer chat facility on Zoom, and we'll put together a structure of questions to the panelists, hopefully that will answer your queries, and then we'll draw the threads together after about an hour or so. My brief introduction is one of deep cynicism. It has been the mantra of successive governments of whatever colour and complexion that the planning system needs mending. And our current government is no different. The Prime Minister, in his introduction to the white paper, promises, and I quote, "radical reform unlike anything we have seen since the Second World War." He describes our planning system as a relic of the mid-20th century that is outdated and ineffective. And the Prime Minister assumes, at least to my mind, a strained mansplaining simile comparing the planning system to an increasingly dilapidated building that the government proposes to tear down and start again. I'm reminded of the words of one of the heroes of our current Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, who, I hope you can see my screen, success consists of moving from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm. The Prime Minister promises, as all other Prime Minister predecessors promised, a planning system that is simpler, clearer, and quicker to navigate, and one that delivers results in weeks and months rather than years and decades. The foreword from the Secretary of State reiterates the message that the government wants to convey: simpler, faster, and more predictable system. The passage that I've just referred to then is followed by a passage that brought a cynical smile to my face when the Secretary of State told us that his proposals seek, amongst other things, to facilitate, and again I quote, "the affordable housing existing communities require." This, you will remember, is from the same Robert Jenrick who approved the West Ferry Printworks development in the East End of London, and then had to admit that his decision appeared biased. The decision was made, you will recall, a day before new rules would have increased the owner's costs by up to £50 million because of changes to an affordable housing requirement that was about to be introduced. I'm sure we'll all agree that the fact that the site was owned by the former Daily Express proprietor, Mr. Desmond, who is a well-known donator to the Conservative Party, could have had nothing to do with the quality of decision-making by the Secretary of State. I think overall, we've been here before. What is clear from the white paper is the government's commitment to deliver 300,000 homes per year, and even more remarkably, an assertion that 1 million of homes will be completed by the end of this Parliament is embedded in this white paper. And in a post-Brexit and post-COVID world, the economic imperative, I think, is obvious to all of us. And for me, one of the most telling sentences in the white paper was in the foreword by the Secretary of State, where he said, and again I quote, "millions of jobs depend on the construction sector, and in every economic recovery, it has played a crucial role." So, quite evidently, the need for development and the jobs associated with it are a huge driving force behind the white paper. And the intention to have development plans, in particular, and planning decisions made quickly creates a conundrum which we're all too familiar with, whether the need is for development to take place quickly without a rigorous and informed decision-making process, because it seems to me at the very outset that quality decisions, evidence-based decisions, self-evidently need evidence and mature reflection and evidence gathering in order to make an informed decision, and that doesn't come quickly. My colleagues Ian Ponter, Killian Garvey and Freddie Humphreys will each address one of the three pillars now contained within the white paper. Pillar 1, planning for development, is going to be addressed by Ian Ponter. You all will know Ian. He has an extensive planning practice. It appears for both sides, developers and local planning authorities. He's got considerable experience in dealing with Section 78 appeals for housing, retail and employment development. And you will all know that he frequently acts for development planning examinations, again, for both sides of the fence, local planning authorities and developers. So Ian, I'll turn over the Pillar 1, planning for development, to you.
Thanks, John. The primary focus of Pillar 1 is local plans. And it's not just content of local plans, it's also the process for their production that the government is keen to examine. John's prefaced some of my remarks in a sense, but the government sees, in terms of local plan content, them to be too long, too detailed and too complicated, with the result that they are inaccessible to too many people. As far as the process is concerned, again, government sees that as taking too long and reliant on too much and too complicated a raft of evidence to support each of them. So I'm going to deal with both what the white paper has to say about content and process with regard to local plans, and run through some of the suggestions that the white paper makes in both respects. Firstly, with regard to content, it's proposed to change the form of local plans, and it's intended that the primary component of a new local plan be a map, albeit a map supported by a key and some text. And there's a broad indication that as far as the text is concerned, the government wants to see local plans reduce in size by about 2/3. And the aim is to move very much more to a web-based document that can be accessed from phones, tablets, and computers, as opposed to leafing through pages and pages of documents. In terms of the substance, there is one central proposed change which is important, and that is the identification of three broad designations of land. Firstly, growth areas. Growth areas will be for substantial new development such as urban extensions, but they might also include large brownfield sites. Secondly, renewal areas, and they will cover the existing built up or urban areas, but they might also include small sites on the edges of villages. And then thirdly, there'll be protected areas. Now they might be Greenbelt, they might be AONBs, conservation areas, they might be ecological sites, and there'll be open countryside, possibly also residential gardens. And what's intended is that within the growth and renewal areas, the map and or the text would specify appropriate uses. So the text will say whether a particular area for growth is intended for residential or employment or a mix. It might also set some broad parameters for development in terms of height of buildings or density of development. And it might also identify sub-areas within a growth area where it's been divvied up for particular parts of the market. So in particular, the government is keen to see certain areas within a growth area earmarked for self-build. We would have supplementary guidance in the form of design guides or codes produced at local level, giving further detail about what particular developments should look like. And that might either be part of the local plan or a separate freestanding document. So it seemed to me that what we have proposed is, within those broad categories of growth or renewal area, there would be allocations for particular sorts of development together with general parameters for that development. In that sense, the map and text would be broadly the same as existing allocations in current local plans. Similarly, within protected areas, there won't be one generic policy of protection. There'll be different levels of protection. So, for example, the Greenbelt will have its own policy provisions providing protection for the Greenbelt. Open countryside, a different set of policy tests providing for the protection of open countryside. Just as the position is now, the change proposed by the white paper is that those policy tests won't be in the local plan, they will be in national policy. And so it won't be for the local plan to repeat national policy on Greenbelt or the open countryside or conservation areas. The reference point will be national policy. Now, in terms of the allocation of land as growth areas or renewal areas, the expectation of the government is that that's going to speed up the development management process. The reason why it will is because in a growth area, your allocation as such is the equivalent of receiving an outline planning permission. So you don't have the further step of having to make an application for outline consent in respect of a growth area. In respect of a renewal area, the effect of that is that there is a presumption in favour of development. So again, that is anticipated to speed up the development management process. Within protected areas, applications for development will be judged against the relevant national policy advice. So just as now, if you make an application for inappropriate development in a Greenbelt, you'll have to demonstrate very special circumstances. And that position, as I understand it, won't change. In terms of how much development is expected to be delivered with these new provisions, well, the first point to note is that a local plan is anticipated to provide for development needs for a period of 10 years. So that compares with 15 years under current framework advice. And secondly, the other headline point is with regard to the housing requirement figure. That will be a binding standard method figure produced by central government. And as John has said, that's set against the government's overall aim, which is unchanged, namely to deliver 300,000 new dwellings per year. And so when it comes to distributing that 300,000 per year across the country, the white paper says that the government will take into account a range of factors, namely affordability, the size of settlements in a particular area, environmental constraints such as Greenbelt, brownfield opportunities, other development needs, whether that be employment or otherwise, and also the need for a buffer to give some flexibility. So presumably what that will mean is that the government, central government, will have to gather and consider local data, for example, on environmental constraints, brownfield opportunities and the like, whereas previously those factors were considered by local planning authorities. So it will be a monumental task for central government to take into account all of those factors and come up with individual figures for individual local planning authority areas. A couple of other points to note emerging from the white paper is this. Firstly, the government is confident that its new approach will succeed in delivering development, and so considers there will be no longer a need for a 5-year housing land supply requirement in national policy. It does recognise that there will be a continuing need for a housing delivery test, looking back, say, over the previous 3 years, and presumably, if an authority area is failing to deliver as anticipated, some kind of penalty will be imposed. For example, continued application of a tilted balance in determining planning applications. So those are some of the substantive points that I wanted to mention. I think the headline points arising out of the white paper. I deal with some process issues. And again, the main headline here is speed. The government considers that it should take no more than 2.5 years from start to end with regard to the production of a local plan. 6 months for a call-in process, call for areas of growth or areas of renewal, 12 months for the preparation of the plan, submission and consultation 6 weeks, examination 9 months, tidying it up and adoption 6 weeks. So maximum 2.5 years, and they're to be reviewed every 5 years. The soundness test will be changed under current proposals, and it will be reduced to one question and one only: is the plan sustainable? I've no doubt that in addressing that one question, the other questions that we've conventionally asked ourselves, like, is this plan consistent with national policy, will inevitably crop up. And so there'll be a whole series of sub-questions within the overriding question of whether or not a plan is sustainable. Sustainability appraisals, they're going to go, and we're told that they will be replaced by a simplified process for assessing environmental impact. No detail given in the white paper, but whatever the simplified process is, it's going to have to meet other legal requirements, like the need to conduct strategic environmental assessment. There's no dodging around those. Duty to cooperate, that's going to go. However, the government recognises that certain cross-boundary issues will still fall to be considered. A deliverability test will still apply, but we're told it's going to be slimmed down. I don't know what that means. So deliverability will still be relevant. Finally, with regard to plan making, there is continued endorsement in the white paper of neighbourhood plans. The government continues to recognise their place in the local plan, the development plan system, and shows no sign of retracting its position on neighbourhood plans. It's not entirely clear to me what they will do, because the local plan is going to go through the process of identifying growth, renewal and protected areas. There's nothing much left in the way of allocation left for a neighbourhood plan to do. It might tidy up on things like detailed design codes. But beyond that, it seems to me that the scope for neighbourhood plans is going to be heavily restricted. Finally, with regard to Pillar 1, it doesn't entirely confine itself to dealing with local plans. There's a little bit on the development management process and planning applications. I needn't run through in any detail, but the main themes are greater use of technology to both make and publicise planning applications, much less supporting information, and stricter adherence to time limits for determination, where extensions beyond 8 weeks and 13 weeks is the exception rather than the rule. And the expectation arising out of all of that, simpler local plans, more straightforward planning applications and speedier determinations, is apparently fewer appeals. We shall see. So that's my brief synopsis of Pillar 1 in the white paper. And I think Pillar 2 is being handled by Freddie.
That is correct. Pillar 2, planning for beautiful and sustainable places, is to be dealt with by the beautiful and sustainable Freddie Humphreys. Again, Freddie, one of our more junior members, high flying, acts again in all areas of town and country planning. He does a great deal of housing, retail, and Freddie does a great deal of high court litigation. He's got experience for both local planning authorities and developers across a whole spectrum of planning policy. And as I've indicated, he will deal with Pillar 2, planning for beautiful and sustainable places, as it appears in the white paper. Over to you, Freddie.
Yeah, cheers, John. Thanks for that introduction. I can't say I'm feeling particularly beautiful or sustainable in this heat at the moment. I think it's starting to get to me, but thank you anyway. Pillar 2, yes, planning for the beautiful and the sustainable, I think it's fair to say is the pillar with the least amount of actual detail in it of the 3 pillars in the white paper. Large parts of it seem to me to be shall we say, spin rather than actually detailed proposals as to things that will actually be done. There are a few in there, but really it seems to me Pillar 2 is more setting out an objective for the planning system that we need to make places look a bit better and be more sustainable without necessarily providing us too much detail as to how that's going to be achieved. But clearly the government has got it into its head that the planning system hasn't been delivering the type of developments that the population of the country actually wants. So phrases like too often excellence in planning is the exception rather than rule, or too often what we do build is low quality and considered ugly by local residents occur throughout the white paper. And that's what Pillar 2 is seeking to address. Now, the first proposal as to how they're going to do this is through the use of detailed design guidance. Now, this is going to be developed, first of all, at a national level. So what we will see is the National Design Guide, National Model Design Code, and a revised manual for streets. Now, they will be used at a high level to both determine applications, but also as a basis for which local authorities, or indeed other groups actually, which we'll go on to in a moment, can set local design codes. When an application then comes in, it needs to be determined in accordance with the locally set code. But if you don't have a locally set code, then the application will be determined against those nationally set standards. If you do have a locally set code, the government doesn't tell us exactly how you want to bring these forwards. And in fact, it leaves forward 3 routes by which locally set codes can be brought forward, all of which exist at the moment. So these can be as part of the local plan process. That's one method. Secondly, they can be via neighbourhood plans. So as Ian's touched upon, that is one of the remaining potential scopes for neighbourhood plans to be used. And then thirdly, it also seems as if locally set design codes can be brought forward on application by application basis, where we're talking about large scale development sites. So actually you'll be setting your own standard for design on your own application, which presumably is not really what they're wanting to achieve, but practically that seems to be what they're doing. A large focus on these design codes is placed on the level of consultation that goes into them. And the white paper tells us that the more consultation has been, and where it can be evidence that this has been taken into account when producing the local design code, then more weight will be attached to those codes when an application is to be determined. So if you have a local plan, presumably set design code that's gone through a full rigorous consultation process, that will attach more significant weight than just one that's been produced on the hoof to do the specific application. But again, there's not really much detail as to what consultation processes will be expected, and the focus is simply on volume of it. So whether or not you get further detail on that, we'll have to wait and see. But it feeds back into this idea John touched upon it in his introduction, that a large part of this white paper is trying to get locals more involved in the planning process. And again, as with a lot of the white paper, we see here large focuses on data, and the idea, it seems to me to be, is going to be that you essentially have tick box design codes. So for any given scheme it comes in, you pull out your relevant design code and you go through and you just see if it meets the specific standards set out in there. And these standards that can just be judged by going yes or no, does it have this? Does it meet the spatial requirements, etc., etc.? And you literally go through and tick them. So it seems to be approaching removing an element of planning judgment from assessing applications, and it's more almost quantitative in its approach. You literally meet the standards or you don't. And this is a recurring theme throughout the paper, and there's talk about how applicants should be able to input their proposed scheme into the relevant computer system, and that will basically tell you whether or not you're likely to get planning permission. So a focus on these codes is, yes, removing planning judgment from the design process, which seems slightly problematic because runs a very real danger, I would have thought, of removing the importance of local context to the determination of any given application. But there we are. The next proposal is that the government wants to support a transition to a planning system which is more visual and rooted in local preferences and character. And to do this, they want to set up a body to support local councils in their development of design codes. So this is very much a resource proposal. So the government is going to provide more assistance to local authorities to ensure that they set high standards of design in their local area. So this is going to be through seemingly the creation of a national body to deal with this, who can then provide infrastructure support by way of services to local councils to deal with design issues. And to feed into this, local authorities will be expected to have a chief officer for design and placemaking, who presumably remit is going to be one of beauty and setting relevant design standards in their area, with support from experts from national government. So that's going to really clearly require quite a high level of funding to provide that. And upskilling as well is one of the emphases under this section, that there will be training provided to local authorities so that they have suitably qualified individuals to deal with these specific design issues. We then have the concept of a fast track for beauty, which seems to say that if you have a nice looking scheme, it should get planning permission quicker than any other scheme. I can't really see conceptually off of that how that's a change. That seems to be basically saying if you meet relevant standards, you will get planning permission, but that's sort of how planning has always worked. You just assess it against whatever the locally set criteria are. So how that's actually going to speed up the process, I'm not entirely sure. But there's a little bit more detail provided to that. So the NPPF is going to be changed to give support to schemes which comply with local design codes. Again, I'm not really sure how, despite them calling that a change, how that actually is a change, because one would have thought where you have already a locally set design code, that is something that attaches weight in the planning process. But so that's more likely to be a shift of focus, increase in importance rather than anything else. In growth areas, so that area Ian was talking about, which is one of the bigger reforms, a site master plan is going to be a requirement of permissions in principle, so that when detailed schemes do come forward, they're already in conformity with what they're required to be. So the idea is that detailed, or an element of the detailed design, is actually done straight away at the well, I'm not sure allocation is the right word, but at that early stage, so that once you have that allocation in a growth area, when schemes actually come forward, they already know what they're required to be doing and can get permission quite quickly. Then the third proposal for fast tracking beauty, which is quite an interesting one, because it's unclear to me how this will work in practice, but what the government is proposing to do is bring in new legislation to create new permitted development rights, to allow what they call popular and replicable forms of development to be approved easily and quickly. So that's therefore a proposal that you can get permitted development for certain types of development, not based on what is already there, but on basically what you're proposing. So if it meets a certain design proposal, it just will have permitted development rights. And they use the expression copybook development. So essentially the concept is going to be that there's certain types of design that if you just simply copy them, you can get permitted development rights for that. So it'd be quite tricky to manage that one, because again, you're using an element of planning judgment there in terms of design to determine whether or not something has permitted development, rather than, you know, our usual scheme of planning development, permitted development, saying, are you currently this? If so, you can become that. And the final proposal under Pillar 2 that's of some actual practical significance, seems to me, is a suggestion that, again, I think Ian's touched upon, is we're going to speed up the environmental assessment proposal. How that is actually going to be done is lacking in detail. Again, there's a lot of talk about data and how the government wants us to be able to use work that's already been done and to streamline the environmental assessment process. So for any given scheme, I think what they would like to see is, rather than you having to do your work from scratch, you can look around, see what anybody else has already done, because data is going to be just more readily available through the planning process. Pick out the relevant bits that are relevant to your scheme and just simply rely upon them and make a few additions here and there if that's necessary. Again, so the practicalities of how that will actually work and what will actually be required in an environmental assessment are somewhat unclear. And the idea is going to be really one more of practicalities. How can we just physically speed up this process? I think there's going to be a loosening of the restrictions in some way on how up to date an assessment has to be. But again, that's going to cause problems with other pre-existing bits of legislation. So to actually get this off the ground, there will be a need for quite widespread legislative reform. Could be quite complicated, and I think could get quite messy for the government quite quickly. But an overview, those are the proposals under Pillar 2, and like I say, there's not loads in there of particular detail, and it does seem to me to be more of a conceptual pillar rather than one of substance. So back to you, John.
Thank you very much, Freddie. The third issue is Pillar 3, planning for infrastructure and connected places. In short, this is really to do address some of the issues that have arisen in practice, and we have a very practical issue to address here. The speaker who's going to speak to these issues is Killian Garvey. Killian is again one of our high-flying juniors at King's Chambers, specialist planning barrister, again does a great deal in terms of housing development up and down the country, number crunching on the 5-year housing land supply. He acts for both local planning authorities and developers, and therefore is particularly experienced and capable of speaking to the practical problems that are facing developers at the moment, and how this white paper at least says it will address those issues. Over to you, Killian. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, John. So the way the white paper works is it's a little bit like reading a development plan policy, because what you've got throughout the white paper is you've got text in a grey box, and that text is purportedly, that's the key proposal that they're suggesting. And then they've got something that they call the wraparound text, which is almost like the explanatory text to a development plan policy, which has some more alternative ideas. But for my part, I'm going to focus on the text in the box that deals with infrastructure. And I'm going to give 6 headline points, and then I'll dig into the detail of each point. So point 1 is that they're proposing to get rid of Section 106 agreements and SIL, abolish them. Point 2, they're going to have a new tax, which is going to be called just the infrastructure levy. Point 3, this is going to be a flat rate set nationally. Point 4, the amount of the levy that you will pay will be determined based on the final value of the development. Point 5, local planning authorities will have more freedom with what they do with the levy, the money that they receive. And point 6 is that you can build affordable housing to offset the levy. So they're my 6 headlines. I'll dig into each one of those points. So point 1, that Section 106 and SIL is going to be abolished. The white paper addresses the point that having these two mechanisms to capture land value is too complicated and uncertain. I think that's an uncontroversial statement, and certainly one I agree with. And indeed, the white paper acknowledges that negotiations on Section 106 agreements are very uneven around the country, with hugely different levels of skill at local authorities and how they deal with them. And indeed, we as barristers, we spend an inordinate amount of time at inquiries sometimes discussing Section 106 agreements and their contents, and it can sometimes be a bit of a painful process at the end of the inquiry process. So selfishly, I'll relish the chance to not have to spend inquiries debating on the Section 106 agreement. But one of the questions immediately that struck me was Section 106 agreements are not just about land value capture. They can be used to do other things, provide other benefits that can sometimes be too cumbersome for conditions. I'm thinking of examples where you might be giving a parcel of land to a local community as open space, and the Section 106 agreement can sometimes govern that. I don't know whether if they're getting rid of Section 106 in the Town and Country Planning Act, what the intention is to replace that, whether it will just be conditions, will be the only way to secure benefits of a scheme. But anyway, point two, that they're going to introduce this infrastructure levy. There's often been a discussion that SIL and Section 106 agreements infringe on the realms of taxation. The white paper doesn't shy away from that. This new infrastructure levy is just that, it's a planning tax. And the white paper doesn't seemingly, is just pretty explicit about that. Point three, that this is going to be a flat rate set nationally. So as I've been thinking about this, it's been clear that this will function a lot more like other forms of taxation. It's going to be far simpler to think of this in terms of almost like a local capital gains tax than it is to think of anything comparable to the current planning regime for capturing land value. So the intention is that there'll be a threshold below which you don't have to pay anything on this levy, and then above this threshold you will have to pay this levy. And currently the white paper says it's unsure whether there's going to be a single rate set nationally or whether there will be area specific rates, but it seemingly is going to be the case that it will be for central government to set these rates as opposed to local governments. But they acknowledge that these area specific rates might be required because in certain areas where land value uplift is insufficient, they might need to have much lower rates than in areas where there's a lot more land value capture. Point four, that the value is based on the final value of the development. The thinking behind this is to allow the development to respond to market conditions, and it applies at the point of occupation. So, of course, one thing that this pandemic has demonstrated is that the viability of a development proposal can radically shift for unexpected reasons during the lifetime of it being built out. So to try and combat that and provide more certainty, the idea is that at the point that you've actually constructed the scheme and you're going to occupy, that's the point at which you bring in and you capture the land value based on what the value of the property is. It's also the idea is that this is going to manage cash flow, because of when you've got developers who are making sizable contributions at the beginning of the constructing a scheme, that can often be burdensome on the developer themselves. So that's why they're trying to move it to the end of the development as opposed to the beginning. And there's a discussion about the potential sanction being for non-payment, being that there'll be prevention of occupation. I confess that struck me as being problematic, because oftentimes the person who might be wanting to occupy the house will have had no say in any of the taxation or levy that needs to be paid, and they might be the ones that loses out. Point five, more freedom for local authorities. The white paper doesn't say this, but it may as well have said local authorities can take this money and do whatever they want with it. Indeed, it even goes as far as saying they can just reduce council tax. So they don't necessarily have to take the money that they receive and spend it on anything directly related to this development proposal. They can do whatever they want with it. And seemingly, there will be no clawback. There would be no opportunity to say, this is the money earmarked for the capacity in that classroom, and therefore if you don't build out that classroom, we can claw it back to the developer. Seemingly that will be done away with. I should also say, this will be collected and spent locally as a form of taxation. And the final point in respect to affordable housing, so if the developer provides affordable housing, that is seen as an in-kind delivery of the levy. So the difference between the price at which the unit was sold to the provider and the market price would be offset from the final cash liability to the levy. So effectively, by providing affordable housing, you can pay less levy at the end of the process. And that's sort of the incentive to try and encourage local developers to build affordable housing to actually make their scheme more viable. So there are my 6 headline points in respect to the infrastructure.
Thank you, Killian. I'm going to turn over to a question and answer session. Thank you for those who have contributed to the 8 questions that have been raised. Some of it actually were addressing Freddie. I think we've got a problem with your mic, or we did have a problem earlier on with your mic. It seemed a bit crackly. It seemed to have resolved itself, but be that as it may. But before I turn over to the questions that have asked by some attendees, I was looking at this issue, and it's really towards Ian. Whilst there is a requirement, and I'll put requirement in inverted commas, to have a local plan in place in 2.5 years, it seemed to me that there was no sanction that's readily apparent in the white paper for those local authorities who don't, for whatever reason, manage to achieve having a local plan within the period of time specified. Did you discern anything different from the white paper? You're mute.
The answer is government intervention. Broadly indicated that if a local planning authority isn't getting on and producing a local plan in a timely way, the process will be taken over by central government.
Interesting.
So that's the sanction. You lose control.
Okay, Killian, if I may ask you a question as well, I'm sure the LPDF members will be very interested in this. How do you think developers will react to the proposals concerning what is essentially the amalgamation of Section 106 and SIL regulations? How will developers respond?
So I think that there'll be some who welcome the fact that this is going to help them with cash flow issues. This is going to help them in terms of certainty and be able to respond to market forces. So those must be things that are welcome changes. One of my practical concerns is that oftentimes, though, during the application stage, developers can use money to make problems go away. And one of the ones that I think about most is highways. So oftentimes you might have it where the highway authority come in and say, well, we've got a gripe with this scheme. And the developer might say, well, here's a chunk of money that we'll provide during the Section 106 agreement, and conveniently the issue falls away. I'm not sure that would be feasible under this current scheme, because it would be, well, at the end of the day, when this is all built out, we will be taxed as every other scheme will be. And out of that levy, you can do whatever you want with that money. You can contribute it to the highway infrastructure if needs be, but we can't earmark and say, here's X amount of money for the highway authority to do X work. Seemingly that won't be the case. But also, the white paper says that the government's ambition is to capture more land value. So it could ultimately result in developers seeing their profit margins reduce with schemes. And if that's ultimately what this does, even if it simplifies it, I doubt many developers are going to see that as a welcome change.
Okay. Some of the questions, very interesting questions that have been raised. One from Edward Orr is, what are the proposals really for the timing of bringing forward the new local plan criteria, and how is it likely to affect either local plans that are currently being progressed or have been recently adopted? I'm slightly changing Edward's question.
No, understood, John. It's proposed that the changes will be made by a comprehensive new suite of legislation. So I think you in your introduction referred to the decrepit building that's been subject to many unsightly extensions over the years. Well, that's going to be knocked down and a new building is going to be put up. So we're going to have new primary and secondary legislation. What the white paper suggests is that new local plans should be in place, will be in place by the end of this Parliament. Now, as I understand it, the end of this Parliament is May 2024. So it's 2.5 years to prepare a local plan. And that obligation kicks in when the new legislation starts. Then we're talking about the end of 2021 for all of this new legislative framework to be in place. So within the next 18 months, it will all have been done, primary and secondary legislation necessary to devise an entirely new planning system. So there we are. That's the proposed timing. There's one other little footnote to that. There is a greater period given if you've got a recently adopted local plan. So if you've got a plan adopted in the last 3 years, you get 3.5 years to prepare a new local plan. Or if you've just submitted a local plan, you get 3.5 years from the new legislation kicking in. So potentially 5 years from now, if the government's timing is right. So that's the broad timescale that they're thinking about. Very swift.
Oh, it's incredibly swift. And I use the word incredibly with a degree of accuracy that's absolutely intended. If they achieve it, I'll believe it when it happens. Matt Evans has a key question. They principally seem to be focused on your area, Ian, if I may say so. Matt raises this point. Really, one of the key issues of concern that's articulated throughout the white paper is the time it takes to prepare a local plan. The plan-led system seems, although it's not expressly stated, to be a commitment of the government, a continued commitment. And Matt really asked the question, shouldn't the emphasis be on creating plans prepared with a lighter touch, perhaps watering down the examination to an extent, because otherwise you're unlikely to achieve your 300,000 dwellings per annum without the imposition of some very clear strategic planning guidance to determine where the unmet housing need has got to go.
Well, the imposition at a strategic level is from central government, because local planning authorities are going to be told what number they need to plug in to the plan, and then they're required to produce the plan within 2.5 years. And inevitably, and this is the avowed intention, it is going to be supported by less rigorous evidence. There is going to be a smaller evidence base. There is not going to be the extensive sustainability appraisal. Duty to cooperate goes. There are going to be less rigorous hurdles for the local planning authority to get over to get their local plan out, and in that way it's hoped that it can be done in that 2.5 year period.
On a similar vein, Neil Tiley from Pegasus raises this question, and it gives rise to obvious practical difficulties. If you're going to deploy a standard method for calculating your housing requirement, even the one that's currently proposed, which is a slight tweak on the versions in 2018 and 2019 that we saw, how can you be formulaic in those circumstances where you don't know what constraints there are, what brownfield opportunities there are in order to secure the housing numbers that are produced by the standard method? It's a point I think you touched upon, but isn't it something of an anomaly that the standard method is going to be deployed to produce a housing number that will then require, in order for that housing number to be delivered, a great more information concerning what opportunities there are or are not in order to deliver that number?
And you might think, John, mightn't you, that the planners on the ground might have a better idea about where the constraints and opportunities lie than some plan makers in Whitehall. So there is a difficulty. I think the process will be, you start off with a standard approach to coming up with a number based on affordability issues. And then in the normal way, you have to plug in local constraints and opportunities, whether it be a brownfield study or an exercise of review of the green belt or whatever. You have to then layer those other criteria on top of the, if you like, the standard method starting point.
Paul Hunt raises an interesting question, which I can direct, I think, towards Killian. What happens when you have these very large sustainable urban extensions? And I'm putting that qualification into Paul's question. You have these large sustainable extensions that we've seen up and down the country, or perhaps new village proposals that are intended to deliver their own infrastructure in both social infrastructures, schools, playing pitches, community buildings and the like. What is intended to those types of development that are already infrastructure rich in terms of the social and economic infrastructure that they're intending to provide? Or is this going to be a one size fits all, essentially a development land tax? You didn't use that expression, Killian, but I'm using it, a development land tax of any and all residential, retail, commercial development?
Yeah, so the white paper is here's our big ideas, and it doesn't give us a huge amount of detail on how this is going to be, particularly because it's going out for consultation. So there's a lot of questions like this, which, you know, we'll have to wait and see when the detail finally emerges. But what I imagine would be the case for a scheme like that is they would look at, well, this is how much money we made from the scheme, you know, gross. And then they'll say, but we had to spend X amount on building out that school. So our net final value is X, which will be lower than the gross value. So they will just, I presume, they will just factor the construction of those benefits and reduce that from their total profit, much like a tax return. This is what we made, but this is what we had to spend to get there. And that will inform then, that final figure will be then taxed based on this national threshold.
Paul Boyfield raises quite an interesting point. I suppose it's a fine grain point. Just concerned about development proposals in a protected zone. Will we expect at some level, national or perhaps even local level, the types of development that could take place in a protected zone? Paul gives the example of solar wind developments in perhaps open countryside. One can think of other examples, agricultural workers' dwellings in open countryside, even in the greenbelt. What will be, or where can we expect to find the policies that will deal with the exception to the protected areas where development may be permitted, where there will be an element of judgment, there will have to be an element of control? I'll throw it open to the whole panel. Perhaps Freddie would like to have his turn.
Yeah, well, my reading of that would be that actually, potentially, the protected areas are the areas where there's the least amount of change under the new system as to the system where we're currently operating, in that you can still make an old style, or, well, a current style planning application for permission in those areas, and it'll be governed and determined against national policy. So you will be in a protected area, but the protected areas don't say no development is allowed here. Some development will be allowed there, and presumably that'll be done in, say, the same way that we see the Greenbelt policy being determined under national policy now. You are by definition inappropriate development unless you then fall within one of the exemptions to that list. So I get the impression, but I might be wrong, that actually that won't be changing that much. It's just sort of determine the planning application as you would do now.
Yeah, I think that's the way I read it. The white paper doesn't really descend to that level of detail, I'm afraid to say. And I mean, what it potentially means is that you don't have, at a local level, a consideration of those issues. the local planning authority is really just concerned about drawing some boundaries between protected areas, growth areas and renewal areas, and then within the growth and renewal areas setting some parameters for development. But if you want to build a wind farm in a protected area, you're then falling back on whatever national policy might have to say about that.
Do you anticipate, or do we anticipate, that in the growth areas there will be requirements for subsets of development, supposing it's allocated for residential, but supposing there's a particular need for rental or specialist forms of accommodation to meet the needs of the elderly in the type? Are we going to get that fine grain level in these growth areas?
It talks about sub areas within growth areas, John, it's more directed at market sectors, and in particular, as I think I mentioned earlier on, sort of self-build or custom-build housing being particularly identified within a growth area, rather than forms of specialist housing. I don't think it has anything to say about that.
Which is an obvious problem, it seems to me, because if government is going to be setting centrally your overall housing requirement, where's the scope for then, well, how do we meet the needs of the elderly within that? Because presumably that varies region by region. But if the government is just simply saying, you need to build X thousand houses in your local area by this date, how do you then allow for the elderly? Where do they come into that? Because if you're not allowed to do your own local assessment because it's been done centrally for you, I mean, at the moment, those people are just going to potentially be left outside in the cold.
Yeah. The other consultation paper, and I think this is raised by one or two other questions, John. The other consultation paper, Changes to the Current Planning System, does talk about the provision of first homes, and as I understand it, the government there, I know we've not talked about that other consultation paper, but the government there is saying that there's got to be, within the affordable housing provision on a site, there's got to be 25% of those affordable housing first homes, and that takes priority.
Well, actually, you have answered a question that was raised by James Stacey that I was going to put to the panel. It does seem to me that whilst we're looking at the white paper, we should remind ourselves it is a white paper, it's a consultation exercise. The devil is going to be in the detail. I think drawing those threads together, what we've highlighted is one of the conundrums that inevitably is associated with development plans. If you want the decisions to be made locally, you've got to have an evidence base, and that's got to feed into the housing requirement. If you want to make changes and exceptions to broad national policies, you've got to have an evidential basis for doing so. And if that's going to flow into the local plan, inevitably there's a quantum of evidence and a quality of evidence point that has to be addressed. Any other thoughts before I turn it over to Paul Brocklehurst to draw together the themes of our discussion?
No, thank you.
Paul, I hope you're still with us. Yes, Paul.
Yes, indeed I am. Indeed I am. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank King's Chambers, yourself, John, Ian, Freddie and Killian for jumping very quickly onto the content of the white paper, Planning for the Future, and providing the LPDF members with this webinar. So a big thank you from the Federation for doing that in a very short space of time. I'm sure that's much appreciated. I also just wanted to, as you say, sort of closing, drawing it all together. As it happens, we now have a regular meeting or video conference with Simon Gallagher of MHCLG, and we had ours on last Wednesday. And what is very clear, and I think it's been highlighted by all the panelists today, is that in terms of the Planning for the Future document, it is a very broad picture document with as many unanswered questions as there are pointers as to the way perhaps the politicians envisage the system developing in the future. And from that perspective, as the Federation, will be interacting with all our members over the coming period, during the period of consultation, to ensure that we try and point government in the direction of answering some of those questions. However, in the meantime, I think one of the important documents, and Ian touched on it towards the end there, is the changes to the current planning system. Because it doesn't, it's certainly MHCLG's intention is that they wish to adopt the changes to the current planning system very quickly indeed. And therefore, in terms of how it impacts on our sector, I think it will be that document which in the short term we need to focus on. And there are some actually quite big issues. Ian touched on it. James, Stacey quite rightly highlighted the issue of first homes and impact on affordable housing delivery. There is the whole issue of the new standard method. And again, we as a federation will be interacting with all the members to ensure our views are put forward in a coordinated manner. Finally, I just want to also say, I think there may be other changes coming in terms of local government reorganisation as well, which may put some of the proposals within these documents into a new perspective. So some of the rumours about amalgamation and unitary authorities, I am told, carries quite a lot of weight as rumours go. And over the next number of weeks, something may develop in that regard. And as I say, that may just put some of what we've been talking about into a slightly different context as well, because at that point, perhaps some of the regional planning issues are made easier rather than more complicated. But all that I'm certain of is at a time of global pandemic, we have decided, or not we, our politicians have decided to potentially change the planning system in a pretty big way. And we just need to ensure that in our interactions, we get it going in the direction that we want it to go in, rather than have something that is not helpful to our business model. So we're very focused on that, and with the help of all our affiliate members and all our full members, I'm keen that we get this, get our responses in, and they're focused in the right way. But as I say, my first priority is to thank King's Chambers, John, and thank you to all panelists for their efforts. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, you're very welcome, Paul. I think we enjoyed it. I certainly did. But my role was, I suspect, the easiest of all. So I'd like to thank Ian, Freddie and Killian, because I know they had to spend quite a few hours working through what is a far from unclear document. Hopefully it will become clearer in the not too distant future. I know we've got 12 weeks consultation. I know your members will want to get in touch with you so you can do a coordinated response that's as comprehensive as possible. So good luck with that, Paul. It's not an easy task that you've got ahead of you.
Yes, I think there are a lot of gaps at the moment.
Okay. Right, I'm going to bring the webinar to an end now. I'd like to thank every one of you for contributing. There was over 89 at one point that attended the webinar, so I appreciate your attention and attendance. And thank you everybody who took the time and trouble to ask some questions, which I managed to put. I think I put the majority of questions to our panel. I'm sure that many more questions remain unanswered. Thank you very much. I'll bring it to an end now.
Cheers, John.